Today's video will explain the role of test plans in the V model. Hello, I'm James Helfrich. An integral component of the V model is the notion of a test plan. And a test plan consists of the acceptance test, system test, and integration test that will be used to validate our software. This video will define those steps as well as discuss how to integrate them best into the development process. So we'll start with the definition of a test plan. In 1970, Winston W. Royce wrote the paper Managing the Development of Large Software Systems, which introduced a development methodology commonly known as the waterfall, although interestingly, he never used the word waterfall in his paper. And in his paper, he emphasized the importance of documentation in the software development process. A big part of this documentation is the test plan. Now, the test plan is a collection of test cases that will be exercised on the software to make sure that it's fit for use. So let's talk about the three parts of a test plan. The first one is an acceptance test. The purpose of an acceptance test is to determine whether the software is fit for use. Fit for use means it's going to do everything that the client expects of it. The output of an acceptance test is just a true or false. Are we ready to ship or are we not? We're not trying to find bugs or determine the quality level. We're just trying to see if it's fit for use. And there's many different types of acceptance testing we can do. For an example, beta testing is an example of acceptance testing. We're going to allow a subset of the target audience to have access to the software before it's ready to see if it works for them. The second part is called a system test. Now, the purpose of a system test is to find defects in the system. In other words, we're going to systematically assess the software from the outside to try to find any problems. Now, this is a form of black box testing. In other words, we have no access to the internal workings of the software. We can provide input, such as user input or files, and take a look at the output. The third is integration testing. And there's actually two different variations of integration testing. One is a form of system testing, where we do black box testing on individual components to see how they interact. And the second type is a white box testing, where we write code inside the code base to validate how individual units of software interact. We're going to focus on that second bit. All three of these together should give us a comprehensive view of where the defects are, as well as whether the software is fit for use. For more than 30 years, Winston Royce's ideas of software development have been the dominant methodology in industry. And then in 2001, things changed a little bit. A group of influential software engineers gathered in Utah to discuss the future of software development and address something they called the software crisis, namely an increasing number of software projects were failing to execute. And one of the key findings of this Agile manifesto was to emphasize working software over comprehensive documentation. And this appeared to be a direct attack against Winston Royce's ideas of software development because he emphasized the importance of documentation. So the question is the Agile Manifesto contrary to Winston Royce's ideas, namely documentation of test plans, or can they work in tandem? And the answer is, well, yes. No. Maybe. Let's take a look at this in more detail. So we'll start with the acceptance test. The acceptance test purpose, as you recall, is to determine whether the software is fit for use. So how do we go about doing that? At some point in time in the software development cycle, someone is going to have to say, this software is ready to ship. The question is, how do you make that determination? Is it going to be a hunch? Or are you just going to make a run through the software? Are you going to make a simple run through the software? Or are you going to have some systematic way to determine this? Now, the acceptance test plan is that systematic way, and it doesn't have to be a series of test cases, but you have to have some sort of documentation of how you're going to do this. So you do it the same every time. Now, the importance of an acceptance test plan is we need to have one location where we dump all these ideas about what is exactly fit for use. And we discover this as the software is developed. In other words, when we first do our requirement solicitation at the very beginning of the project, then that's going to give us a pretty good idea of what the basic functionality required for this to be fit for use is. As we go through the system design and unit design, we're going to discover more about the process. And we're going to go back and ask our stakeholders and customers what they really want. And we're going to learn more about the project as we go. This means we have to adjust our acceptance test plan. All this information needs to be gathered over the course of the project. And the project may last a few weeks or may last a few years. The longer the project lasts, the more likely it is that we're going to forget something. And that's the importance of the acceptance test plan. This is one location to put all that information. Now, the second part is the system test plan. The system test plan is to try to find defects in the system. And recall, this is a form of black box testing. In other words, we don't have access to any of the source code or any of the internals of the program. All we have access to the input and the expected output. Now, as we go through the software development process, all the way from a requirements solicitation down to actual coding, we're going to learn new test cases. The question is, where do we put those test cases? Do we write them down? Do we try to remember them? Do we write automation? Now, ideally, all these system tests should eventually be in the form of automation. I should be able to push a button and they should all be executed automatically. The problem is we can't actually write the automation until we have working software of some form, right? So where do you put those test cases? The system test plan is just a document to store those. Now, eventually, the software will be written enough that we can actually execute some of these tests. Usually, we do it manually first just to make sure it works, and then we write automation to make sure we never have to do it again. Once that automation is written, we can remove that test case from this test case plan. By the time our program is finished, our system test plan should be empty because all those test cases are already represented in the system automation code. Now, the third part of the system test plan is the integration test plan. And here I want to validate that individual units of software work together as expected. Now, as we do our component design, we're going to learn about the different units that have to be written, but they're not written yet. In other words, we cannot yet write code to validate those tests until the units are actually written. So the integration test plan is just going to be a place we write down those test cases as we discover them, as we go through the component design process. Now, eventually, of course, we're going to execute these integration tests. Now, these integration tests are white box tests. In other words, they're written inside the code using a unit test framework. As this code is written, we can convert our integration test plan, which is a bunch of test cases, into actual code, and then we can remove them from the integration test plan. In other words, by the time all the units have been thoroughly written and tested, and we're going to start executing the integration tests, then the integration test plan should be empty because all the components thereof, all their test cases, are now part of our integration unit tests. We can learn more about the V model, about test plans, about acceptance, integration, and system tests in the V model chapter of the software design textbook.